Nobody wants to ask this question out loud, but it's been quietly hanging over Cleveland all season. What if the Browns didn't fail? What if everything you've been watching, the losses, the confusion, the stalled offense, the chaos, wasn't a collapse at all, but the result of a plan working exactly as intended? Because when you zoom out, something doesn't add up. Teams don't usually look this unprepared by accident. Coaches don't suddenly forget concepts they once mastered. And franchises don't stumble into back-to-back disaster seasons without someone, somewhere, understanding the consequences. Yet here we are. Kevin Stefanski's future is supposedly undecided. Shedeur Sanders is stuck behind one of the worst offensive situations in football. And the Browns keep insisting they're evaluating, adjusting, and competing, even as the results say otherwise. So here's the uncomfortable thought that started circulating among analysts and insiders. What if the Browns weren't trying to win the way fans think they were? Not openly tanking, not waving the white flag, but quietly accepting losing while making it look like they were fighting every week. Close games, conservative decisions, outdated schemes that technically function but never threaten modern defenses. And if that sounds far-fetched, stay with me. Because reports suggest the organization still hasn't made a final decision on Stefanski. On the surface, that sounds like patience, maybe even optimism, but some analysts believe that uncertainty isn't for Browns fans at all. It's positioning, damage control, a way to soften what everyone inside the league already suspects is coming. Or worse, a way to justify keeping him. There's a theory floating around, and to be clear, this is speculation, not confirmed fact, that Stefanski may have only one path to survival. And it has nothing to do with winning games this season. It has everything to do with whether he accomplished what the front office quietly needed him to do. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to stay locked in on all the latest NFL drama, make sure you hit that like button. It helps the video reach more people who love this content just like you. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another update, reaction, or storyline as it unfolds in real time. I also want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think about Shedeur Sanders' performance and the Browns' collapse? Drop your thoughts below and let's talk about it. And don't forget to share this video with friends who follow the NFL. Your support truly keeps the channel moving forward. Lose just enough, stay competitive enough, secure draft position, buy time. If that sounds cold, it should. Because if that theory holds any weight, then Shedeur Sanders wasn't just dropped into a bad situation. He may have been placed into an impossible one, asked to develop, lead, and take hits in an offense that was never fully built to succeed. And that's where this story stops being about play calling or wins and losses, and starts becoming about intent. Was this just another chapter of Brown's dysfunction? Or was it a calculated stretch of pain designed to reset the franchise while keeping jobs intact upstairs? Because here's the part no one can ignore. At the end of this season, one decision will quietly answer everything. If Kevin Stefanski is gone, then the Browns failed spectacularly while trying to win. Embarrassing, but honest. But if he stays, then fans will have to seriously consider whether what looked like incompetence was actually execution. And once you see the evidence analysts are pointing to, you'll understand why this question refuses to go away. Because what happened next doesn't just affect a coach's job. It could define Shedeur Sanders' entire future. Something about Kevin Stefanski's job status doesn't pass the smell test anymore. When national reporters came out and said the Browns haven't made up their mind yet, most fans took that at face value. Fair enough. Coaches survive bad seasons all the time if there's a late push, some progress, something to point to. But when analysts started breaking down that report, the tone changed fast. Because waiting doesn't always mean evaluating. Sometimes it means positioning. According to multiple league insiders discussing the situation, the idea that these final games will suddenly decide Stefanski's future feels unlikely. One analyst flat out said he'd be shocked if 3 games were enough to flip a decision that's been forming all year. And that's where the conversation took a sharp turn. Instead of asking whether Stefanski can save his job, analysts started asking who this report was really for. The theory is simple, and again, this is interpretation, not confirmed fact. If Stefanski is on his way out, his agent has every incentive to control the narrative. You don't want the league seeing you as a coach who got run out of town. You want teams thinking you were still in the mix, still fighting, still respected internally. That's why the phrase, "they haven't decided yet," matters. It suggests uncertainty. It suggests effort. It suggests a coach who's clawing for his job instead of one who's already lost it. One analyst used a phrase that cut through all the politeness. He called Stefanski a dead man walking. Not in a dramatic sense, in a practical one. As in, everyone around the league already knows what's coming, but no one wants to say it outright just yet. And if that's true, then this report isn't about Cleveland's future. It's about Stefanski's next stop. But here, where it gets even stranger. If the Browns were truly undecided, you'd expect to hear optimism, praise, some kind of roadmap for improvement. Instead, the criticism keeps piling up. Play-calling decisions, lack of offensive evolution, refusal to adapt. The same issues being mentioned week after week with no visible correction. That doesn't sound like a coach buying himself time. It sounds like a coach being allowed to finish something. And that's where the speculation starts to creep in. Because analysts have pointed out there's only one scenario where this undecided status actually makes sense. Not if Stefanski suddenly wins games, but if ownership believes he did exactly what was quietly expected of him. That idea alone flips the entire report on its head. Suddenly, waiting isn't about hope, it's about confirmation. Confirmation that the plan, whatever that plan was, played out the way it needed to. And if you think that sounds extreme, consider this. Teams don't usually keep coaches after back-to-back disastrous seasons unless there's a reason that goes beyond the scoreboard. Which raises the question no one wants to answer yet. Is Kevin Stefanski being evaluated for failure or for execution? Because depending on how this ends, this report won't age as cautious. It'll age as a warning sign everyone missed. There's only one scenario where Kevin Stefanski survives this. Not the polite version, not the hopeful version, the uncomfortable one. And to be clear right up front, what you're about to hear is speculation being discussed by analysts, not a confirmed report. But once it was said out loud, it changed how people looked at this entire season. The idea didn't come from a fan rant or social media noise. It came from league voices calmly walking through a hypothetical that disturbingly made sense. Hear how they framed it. If ownership truly believed Stefanski failed at his job, he'd already be gone. Coaches don't usually get indefinite evaluations after back-to-back disasters unless the results themselves aren't the only metric being judged. Wins and losses matter, unless something else mattered more. That's when an analyst dropped a phrase that stopped the conversation cold. He executed the plan flawlessly. At first, it sounded absurd. What plan could possibly justify what Cleveland fans have watched? But the analyst didn't mean flawless football. He meant flawless alignment with a bigger objective. The hypothetical goes like this. If the front office believed the roster wasn't ready to compete, whether because of cap limitations, past contracts, or long-term strategy, then the worst possible outcome would have been finishing in the middle. Not bad enough to reset, not good enough to contend. So instead, the safest route would be controlled losing. Not openly tanking, not embarrassing the brand, just enough losses to secure draft position while maintaining plausible effort. Competitive games, conservative decisions, schemes that technically function but don't stretch defenses, seasons that can be explained away as developmental. And if that was the assignment, again, this is hypothetical, then Stefanski didn't fail. He delivered. Back-to-back seasons with minimal wins, high draft positioning, No public admission of rebuilding, no backlash from ownership admitting defeat, and most importantly, time. Time for the front office to reset contracts. Time to plan the next quarterback decision. Time to extend job security without ever saying the quiet part out loud. That's why this theory is so unsettling. Because if that's the lens ownership is using, then firing Stefanski would actually contradict the strategy. You don't fire someone for doing what you ask them to do. One analyst even said this scenario only reveals itself after the season ends. Fans wait for Black Monday. The announcement never comes. And suddenly, what looked like confusion starts looking intentional. Now, not everyone buys this. Another analyst reacted with genuine disgust, calling the idea of tanking while pretending to win the grossest thing he'd ever heard. Because if true, it doesn't just manipulate fans, it sacrifices players, especially young quarterbacks. And that's where this theory crosses a line. Because if Stefanski survives, it won't be because the Browns believe he's the future. It'll be because he was useful. And if that's the case, then this wasn't just a bad stretch of football. It was a season designed to look like failure, while quietly being treated as success. Before going any further, this needs to be said clearly. What you're about to hear is a theory being discussed by analysts, not a confirmed strategy, leaked memo, or reported plan. There is no proof the Browns intentionally tanked, but there is a growing conversation about whether the results of the past 2 seasons line up a little too cleanly to ignore. And once you hear how the theory works, you'll understand why it's gained traction. The 2-year tank idea isn't about losing loudly. It's about losing quietly. According to this speculation, the Browns weren't trying to implode or reset publicly. They were trying to stay competitive enough to avoid backlash while still landing near the bottom of the standings. That's a tightrope, and it requires subtlety. You do strip the roster down to nothing. You don't announce a rebuild. You keep just enough veterans to appear serious. You blame injuries. You point to youth. You talk about development and culture. And on Sundays, you lose just often enough. In this theory, the goal wasn't to win games. It was to avoid finishing in the middle. Because the middle is where franchises get stuck. No elite draft picks. No real contention, just enough hope to delay change. 2 bad seasons solve that. High draft position, reset timelines, options at quarterback, flexibility the following offseason, and most importantly, time for the front office to extend its runway without publicly admitting failure. That's why analysts say this wouldn't have required anyone saying the words tank out loud. You don't have to tell a coach to lose. You just don't give him the tools to win at a high level. An underwhelming offensive line, limited weapons, a scheme that isn't fully modernized, conservative game plans that technically make sense but rarely push the advantage. Everything stays defensible. Every loss has an explanation. Now here, where this theory becomes unsettling. If this was the quiet approach, then the team still needed a quarterback on the field. Someone to evaluate, someone to absorb hits, someone to sell hope to the fan base. And that's where Shedeur Sanders enters the picture. Again, this is speculation, but analysts suggest that in a soft rebuild, a young quarterback can unintentionally become the buffer. He takes the blame for struggles that are structural. His development stalls while the organization benefits from the losses. Not because anyone wants him to fail, but because the losses themselves are useful. Critics of the theory push back hard, and rightfully so. They argue incompetence explains everything just as easily. Bad coaching, poor roster construction, a system that never evolved. That explanation is cleaner, less sinister, easier to accept. But supporters of the theory point to one thing that keeps it alive. Intentional or not, the Browns ended up exactly where a 2-year reset would want them to be. Poor record, high draft leverage, multiple future paths available. And that's why the question refuses to go away. Because if this really was just failure, someone should be paying for it. But if no one does, then fans will be left wondering whether what looked like chaos was actually strategy hiding in plain sight. Whether the Browns were incompetent or quietly resetting, one thing is undeniable. Shedeur Sanders paid the price. And the reason is simple. When an organization isn't fully committed to winning right now, the quarterback becomes the shock absorber. He takes the hits, he takes the blame, and he takes the narrative weight of a season that was never built to support him. Shedeur stepped into one of the worst offensive environments in football. A bottom-tier offensive line, limited separation from receivers, a scheme that rarely created easy throws. That combination is brutal for any quarterback, especially one still learning the speed of the league. And if this was truly about evaluation, then the setup failed him. Quarterback development requires clarity, repetition, confidence, but Shedeur was asked to survive behind protection that collapsed instantly, execute concepts defenses had already figured out, and carry an offense that offered him no margin for error. That's not development, that's exposure. Now, to be clear, there's no confirmed evidence he was put in this position intentionally. Analysts aren't saying the Browns wanted him to fail, but they are saying the infrastructure around him made failure far more likely than success. In a soft rebuild, this happens more often than teams admit. You keep the quarterback on the field because you need answers. You tell fans you're evaluating. And slowly, the losses stack up, useful losses, while the quarterback absorbs the physical and mental wear. The worst part: when the season ends, the organization can reset. New schemes, new personnel, new explanations. But the quarterback carries the scars. Shedeur's confidence, rhythm, and timing were put under constant stress. Not because he lacked talent, flashes proved otherwise, but because nothing around him functioned consistently. So when people ask why his development stalled, the answer isn't complicated. He didn't fail. He was placed in a role where survival mattered more than success. The most damning part of this entire situation isn't the losses. It's how predictable they've become. Analysts watching the Browns' offense keep coming back to the same conclusion. Kevin Stefanski's system looks stuck in another era. Not broken in a dramatic way, just outdated. The kind of offense that technically functions but rarely surprises anyone. And that's a problem in today's NFL. Defenses evolve fast. Coordinators adjust weekly. Concepts that worked 3 or 4 years ago get studied, dissected, and shut down. The teams that survive are the ones constantly refreshing, disguising, and creating confusion before the snap. That's exactly what Cleveland hasn't been doing. One analyst put it bluntly: Stefanski is running concepts he leaned on years ago, while defensive coordinators have already built counters for them. There's minimal motion, few shifts, little window dressing to force defenders to hesitate. Everything comes out clean and obvious. And what makes this criticism so heavy is that Stefanski knows better. Earlier in his tenure, he was praised for creativity, motion at the snap, clever red zone designs, plays that manufactured space instead of asking players to win one-on-one every down. Those elements didn't disappear because they stopped working. They disappeared because they stopped being used. That's why this doesn't feel like a young coach learning on the fly. It feels like someone who hasn't updated the system. One analyst described it perfectly, like refusing to refresh the page while the rest of the league moved on. The result is an offense that asks too much of the quarterback and too little of the scheme. Instead of creating easy reads, Shedeur was forced into tight windows. Instead of slowing defenses down with motion, he was facing clean looks at full speed. That's not how modern offenses help young quarterbacks survive. Now, there are 2 ways to explain this. The first is complacency. Coaches get comfortable. They trust what worked before. They resist change until it's too late. The second explanation, and again, this is speculation, is that innovation wasn't the priority. That the goal wasn't to push the ceiling, but to stay functional while accepting losses. Either way, the outcome is the same. An offense frozen in time doesn't just fail to score. It fails to protect the quarterback from the realities of today's NFL. And when defenses know what's coming before the ball is snapped, the play is already over. That's the environment Shedeur Sanders was asked to operate in. Not because he couldn't handle more, but because the system never gave him the chance. This idea doesn't feel as far-fetched in Cleveland as it would anywhere else. Because the Browns have done this before. Not quietly, not subtly, openly. From 2016 to 2017, the organization committed to a full teardown. Veterans were traded. Wins were deprioritized. Draft capital became the goal. The result was historic, 115, followed by 0-16. A combined 131 record that was painful, humiliating, and completely intentional. And here's the important part. Ownership signed off on it. Jimmy Haslam approved a multi-year plan built around losing now to gain leverage later. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't denied. It was the strategy. And in terms of assets, it worked. The Browns landed elite draft picks, reset the roster, and bought themselves time. That history matters. Because it proves one thing beyond debate. Cleveland is willing to endure short-term disaster if they believe the long-term payoff justifies it. But this time feels different. Back then, the rebuild was transparent. Fans knew, players knew, expectations were set. Nobody pretended those teams were trying to compete for anything meaningful. If a similar reset is happening now, and again, this is speculation, it would be far more calculated, quiet, designed to look like bad luck instead of bad intent. Injuries become the explanation. Youth becomes the excuse. Development becomes the shield. And unlike the last rebuild, there's a quarterback on the field being told he's the future. That's what makes the comparison unsettling. The Browns have already proven they're comfortable with extreme measures. The only question is whether they've learned how to hide them better. Because if this really was another reset, the precedent exists. The difference is this time, the damage wouldn't just be in the standings. It would be written into the development of a young quarterback who never knew he was part of a bigger picture. If there's one part of this situation that keeps analysts circling back, it's Andrew Berry's position. Because while coaches take the heat publicly, general managers usually don't survive long stretches of failure unless ownership believes there's a bigger picture at work. And yet, despite the record, despite the roster issues, Berry's seat doesn't appear nearly as hot as you'd expect. That alone raises questions. Analysts have pointed out that Berry is widely viewed as safe, not just for this offseason, but beyond it. And in the NFL, perceived safety often tells you more than press conferences ever will. It suggests alignment, trust, or at the very least, patience that hasn't been shaken. The theory some analysts are floating, again, unverified, is that the timeline favors the front office far more than it favors the coaching staff or the quarterback. Hear how that math works. If the Browns use their draft position to select another quarterback, the clock resets. A new QB doesn't come with immediate expectations. Development takes time. 3 years minimum. That window alone buys job security. Fast forward a few seasons, and even if that quarterback doesn't become a star, the front office can point to process. Evaluation, development cycles, external factors. Suddenly, a decade passes without real success, but with constant justification. One analyst called it an incredible heist, not because it guarantees winning, but because it guarantees survival. And to be fair, this isn't unique to Cleveland. It's an NFL reality. Front offices that control the narrative control the timeline. Drafting quarterbacks extends careers. Resetting cycles delays accountability. But in Cleveland, this possibility lands differently. Because if Berry truly is insulated, then the failures of the past 2 seasons don't trigger consequences. They create opportunity. Opportunity to pivot. Opportunity to draft again. Opportunity to explain away what didn't work. And in that environment, the quarterback currently on the roster becomes transitional. Not intentionally discarded, not sabotaged on purpose. just replaceable. That's the unsettling part. Because if job security exists regardless of outcome, the urgency to maximize the present disappears. Development becomes optional, winning becomes delayed, and accountability becomes flexible. None of this proves intent. It doesn't confirm a plan, but it does explain why no one seems panicked. When the people making the decisions feel safe, losing doesn't always force change. Sometimes it becomes part of the strategy. And that's why Andrew Barry's position matters more than any press release. Because it may explain why this situation was allowed to drift as long as it did, and why the fallout keeps landing everywhere except the top. Everything comes down to one moment. Not a play, not a press conference, a decision. When this season ends, the Browns won't need to explain what happened. They'll reveal it, and they'll do it without saying a word. Because Kevin Stefanski's fate quietly answers every question fans have been arguing about all year. If he's fired, the story is simple, painful, but simple. The Browns tried to win, failed badly, and hit the reset button. In that scenario, the past 2 seasons become a case study in incompetence. Poor roster construction, stagnant coaching, misaligned vision. Embarrassing, yes, but honest. However, if Stefanski stays, the narrative shifts entirely. Keeping a coach after back-to-back disastrous seasons doesn't happen by accident. Not in today's NFL. Not unless ownership believes the results served a purpose beyond the standings. That's when the speculation hardens. Because retaining Stefanski would suggest the losses weren't disqualifying, that they were tolerable, maybe even useful. And that opens the door to the idea that this stretch wasn't judged by wins and losses alone. Analysts have said this is the moment they're watching. Not draft night, not free agency, Black Monday. Fans will wait for the announcement. Media will prepare the obituary. And if nothing happens, silence becomes the loudest answer of all. That silence would force people to reframe the last 2 seasons, not as chaos, but as controlled decay, not as failure, but as patience wearing a disguise. Now none of this proves intent. Ownership could simply believe Stefanski deserves one more chance. Continuity matters, stability matters. But context matters more. 6 wins across 2 seasons, an offense that never evolved, a young quarterback left to tread water. If that isn't enough to force change, then something else must be at play. That's why this moment matters. Because when the decision is made, the debate ends. And whatever choice Cleveland makes, it won't just define Kevin Stefanski. It will tell you exactly what these last 2 years were really about. At some point, the blame has to stop landing on the wrong person. Because when you strip this season down to its core, Shedeur Sanders isn't the reason it unraveled. He's the easiest target, but not the correct one. Quarterbacks always take the heat. They touch the ball every play. Their mistakes are loud. Their struggles become headlines. But context matters, and Shedeur's context has been brutal from day one. He wasn't placed into a functional offense and asked to elevate it. He was dropped into a broken one and asked to survive. A bottom-ranked offensive line collapsing almost immediately. Receivers struggling to separate. Play designs that rarely created simple, on-time throws. That's not an evaluation environment. That's a stress test. And despite that, flashes still showed up. There were moments where timing clicked, where anticipation was visible, where poise under pressure hinted at what could exist with even modest support. Those moments didn't happen by accident. They happened because the baseline talent is there. Analysts have pointed this out repeatedly. When execution around him improved even slightly, the offense stabilized. Not exploded, stabilized. And for a young quarterback, that matters. The bigger issue is what he wasn't given. He wasn't given a scheme designed to help him early. He wasn't given consistent protection. He wasn't given the benefit of structure that allows quarterbacks to play fast instead of think fast. Instead, he was forced into tight windows, predictable looks, and constant second-and-long situations. That environment doesn't reveal who a quarterback is. It distorts it. Now, that doesn't mean Shedeur is perfect. He has things to clean up, like every young QB. But development requires intention. It requires a system that meets the player halfway. That never happened. So when people ask whether Shedeur is the problem, the answer is uncomfortable but clear. He wasn't put in a position to be the solution. And until that changes, any judgment passed on him says more about the situation than the quarterback himself. No matter which version of this story you believe, one thing is unavoidable. This version of the Browns can't continue. Whether the past 2 seasons were defined by miscalculation or quiet acceptance, the outcome has reached the same point. Something has to change. The system, the structure, the philosophy. And that change is coming. Kevin Stefanski's offense, as it exists today, has run out of excuses. It's either over in Cleveland or about to be forced into a complete overhaul. There is no middle ground left. The league has passed it by, and the results have made that impossible to ignore. For Shedeur Sanders, that reality matters more than anything else. Because regardless of how this chapter ends, he's walking into a reset. New voices, new concepts, a chance to be evaluated in an environment that doesn't ask him to carry dysfunction on his back. If Stefanski is fired, a new staff arrives knowing exactly what went wrong. They won't inherit optimism, they'll inherit urgency. And urgency often brings clarity, modern schemes, defined roles, a real plan for quarterback development. If Stefanski stays, the pressure shifts instantly. Continuity becomes a mandate, not an excuse. The offense would have to evolve or expose itself completely. Motion, adaptation, accountability, there would be nowhere left to hide. Either path forces change. And that's why the ending of this story isn't as bleak as it feels right now. Shedeur hasn't lost his window. He hasn't lost his talent. What he lost was stability, and stability can be rebuilt faster than people think when the right decisions are made. The bigger question is whether Cleveland will finally choose clarity over comfort. Because the past 2 decades have shown what happens when resets are delayed instead of embraced. Hope turns into noise, evaluation turns into excuse, and young talent gets caught in between. This offseason won't answer every question, but it will answer the most important one. Is Cleveland ready to move forward, or just willing to survive another cycle? Whatever happens, one thing is clear. The reset isn't optional anymore. It's already in motion. And for the first time in a long time, that might actually be the best thing for Shedeur Sanders.
If you enjoyed today's breakdown and want to keep up with all the drama, trades, and behind-the-scenes action in the NFL, then don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps this channel grow and lets us know you love this kind of content. And hey, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends, your group chats, or anyone who loves football as much as you do. The more the conversation spreads, the better it gets. Most importantly, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss when we drop fresh stories, wild rumors, or breaking updates that the mainstream media won't talk about.